The views expressed on the following program do not necessarily represent those of this station or its management. It's time for Where You Live with Gene and Tony, the show that's all about owning, buying, selling, renting, and association management. If it involves a home, we'll talk about it. Here's your chance to get your homeowner questions answered. From the Natural Lawn and Landscape Studios, here's Gene and Tony.
Needed the shelter of someone's arms, and there you were. Needed someone to understand my ups and downs.
Good morning. Welcome to Where You Live with Gene and Tony. I'm Gene Sullivan.
And I'm Tony Crockett. It's good to be here this weekend.
It is. How are you doing?
I'm okay.
I am too.
Although we were talking about it's been a cold week this week, and we've been talking cruises and charter airfare to Cancun.
Oh, this is the time of year you take out all those travel brochures and
That's
just
right.
look, and it just helps you get through the winter.
I was wishing we had plans.
Yeah. And also want to welcome our board op, Chris Wyatt Earp Huberty, with the quickest fingers on the board. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
Good. And this is Where You Live with Gene and Tony, the show that is all about truth, justice, and the association way. What do you think of that, Tony? Huh?
I like that. That's got a good ring to it.
It does, doesn't it? Well, we are brought to you by Extreme Exteriors and American Family Insurance, the Kim Bennett Agency. And, of course, we're broadcasting live from the Natural Green Lawn and Landscape Studios. Remember, Natural Green is a locally owned and operated lawn and landscape care company. Their mission to use the most environmentally sensitive products available to keep your lawn and landscape looking lush, beautiful, while still healthy for both people and pets. Give them a call, won't you, at 763-213-2410. We have got a great show lined up. We've got some really interesting stories this week, and it's around a certain theme. But I guess that'll come out as we continue on. So without further ado, let's begin with property management in the news. Property management in the news, of course, is brought to you by Home Furniture and Abbey Floor Coverings. Their showrooms are staffed with professionals who will help you choose what you need to fit both your lifestyle and budget. Whatever you need, chances are they'll have what you're looking for. Now, if you wish to avail yourself of special pricing and discounts you won't find anywhere else, all Where You Live listeners can call Customer Service Coordinator Lori Matson at 952-224-2663. That number again, 952-224-2663, and ask for your Where You Live with Gene and Tony special pricing. Our first story comes from a website newsfeed called Management Trust from the beginning of February, and it's entitled Squatters' Rights. Now, we've talked about this before, Tony, on the show. There are people who are squatting in abandoned homes, and they're transient people who've been taking over a number of properties and homes around the country, and they say that there is this new breed of what they call an instant resident who is now appearing in many homes all across the country, and it appears that the crux of it, what they're using to justify being able to do this, is a law that we have on our books that goes back from the beginning of our country called adverse possession.
Yeah, the story says that almost every state, or this adverse possession type of legislation exists in some form in every state in the country. All right.
Yeah, now for our listeners, adverse possession, why this became a law and something that became established is early on, of course, in our country's history when people were expanding out across the West. The country, our nation, wanted to encourage people to be able to to populate the entire country because it would be easier to have control if your people and citizens are everywhere. And so people would be able to, through adverse possession, which basically says that if there's an abandoned piece of property and someone will go on that property and maintain it themselves and live there, after a 7 to 15 year period of time, if there is not any challenge, and that's the key, not any challenge from another owner, then the property will be theirs. Well, a lot of people, because of this huge foreclosure issue, thought, hey, that's the way for us to get free homes for people. You know? And so a lot of people have been going into these unoccupied homes and have been trying to claim adverse possession. But there's been some issues with that.
It sounds like it's not only occurring on an individual level. I mean, just recently there was a story about some squatter in Florida somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't think he was part of any organized movement. He was just doing this on his own. But there is an organized movement called Occupy America.
Yeah.
Isn't that what it's called?
The
We talked
Occupy
about it
movement?
a year. Yeah, a year ago. They actually have a website, or there's many websites online where people can go to find out how to do this, how to become a squatter, and how to assert these rights of adverse possession to take over abandoned property. So it's become an organized movement.
Yeah, no, some of those things included, they would were encouraged to go to a vacant property, drill through the locks, change the locks, right? And to be able to start setting up their home, even though the utilities may not be turned on.
That's right. Early on, that's what was happening. People were living in homes with no utilities. They weren't necessarily paying property taxes, which is one of the requirements of adverse possession, is you have to pay property taxes. But also they were using falsified documents in some cases, right?
And that's the key, and that's what this article brings up. We're talking about people that aren't just we're not talking about the law of adverse possession where we have unclaimed land for miles and miles, and someone is staking out a piece for themselves to homestead for themselves. We're talking about people in urban and suburban areas where there are neighbors and people next door going in, doing, taking possession of the home.
Drilling the locks out, moving in.
But then, like you said, they go one step further and they start creating and falsifying documents.
Sure.
So when people come up and say, hey, who are you?
Right.
Because in a homeowners association,
someone
do
may notice. That's right.
Then they say, oh, here's my lease. Here's my
title to the property.
Yeah.
And it might be falsified.
And so this really isn't adverse possession. This is thievery.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Don't you?
Yes, I do. I agree with you.
Yeah. I don't see it any other way than that. The other issue about this that I find very interesting has to do with the other side of that coin. The people in homeowner associations who live there are paying their monthly assessments, and they see a squatter take place in a vacant home. They complain to their board of directors, and they have issues with the board.
Because the board doesn't get rid of these squatters.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah. Unfortunately, the board doesn't have, or the homeowners association has almost no legal standing here, because so many of these disputes and so many jurisdictions look at it as a landlord-tenant dispute between the squatter, so-called tenant, and the owner of the property, the so-called landlord. So then it becomes an issue where the owner has to actually go through a formal eviction process to get these squatters out of there. And the homeowners association is left with no powers and no rights to intervene at all.
Yeah. So here you are, an association having to spend extra money to go out of their way to prove that someone has illegal documents. But they've got to do that in order to be
and
able
I'm not
to
even
preserve
sure
the
they
property.
can do that. I'm not even sure they can do that, because I think the big crux of the problem is if the owner of the townhouse, for example, has truly abandoned it, they aren't there to evict these squatters. The board, the homeowners association, doesn't necessarily have any legal standing to evict. We come
No,
up
they-
against that all the time. They're not the owner of the property. They're not the landlord. So the courts look at them and go, well, who are you? How can you have no right to evict a tenant
Yeah.
when you have no claim in the house?
But this really puts people that are sitting on the board of their association in between the proverbial rock
Yeah,
and a
that's
hard
right.
place, doesn't
That's
it?
right. That's right.
Because here they don't like what's going on anymore. But now here they have to spend the association's finances, which are very finite, to try and get something done.
Here's a point. Adverse possession applies to one certain circumstance where a property is not being used. It's been abandoned. But in a homeowners association, the entire property has not been abandoned. You know what I'm saying? It's still being used,
interesting point.
and there's still shared expenses.
Yes.
So
Well, let's take a quick break right now. We will be back with more Where You Live with Gene and Tony and wrap up this squatter rights issue after these messages.